Hi, my name is Paul Cherashore from the Philadelphia Overdose Prevention Initiative, and we are here today to discuss Philadelphia's opioid crisis. Mayor Kenney's opioid task force issued its final report in May, and we'll be discussing one of the more controversial task force recommendations, the creation of supervised injection facilities, also known as SIFs, and in Philadelphia known as community user engagement sites, or CUEs. Earlier this summer, the city moved to force Conrail to evict the homeless heroin users from its train tracks, as well as day users, running between American and Emerald Streets. The August eviction has added an urgency to what has already been a serious problem in Kensington and the region: massive numbers of fatal overdoses. In 2016, in Philadelphia alone, 900 people overdosed fatally, and in 2017, we were expecting over 1,200 overdoses. With us in the studio are Chris Moraff, a freelance journalist who covers the drug war and associated topics for the Daily Beast and other publications, and Devin Reaves, a member of the Central Committee of the Philadelphia Overdose Task Force. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to be here.
First question is for you, Chris. Can you briefly describe the extent of the national opioid problem in 30 seconds or less, and why Philly's in particular has attracted so much press attention?
Well, there isn't one opioid problem, and I don't even like to use the term opioid crisis, because what we really have is an overdose crisis. It wouldn't be the situation that it is if there weren't so many people dying. So getting that out of the way, the opioid problem is different in Philadelphia than it is in rural West Virginia. In many cases in rural America and suburban America, it started with what some would say is an overprescription of opioid medications and the introduction of OxyContin. I think most of that was acute care diversion, over-prescribing on the front end after surgeries and dental procedures, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, the hammer comes down a little bit too hard on the chronic pain side, and not enough is focused on the acute care, unless you talk to actual emergency room doctors. Philadelphia in particular, what makes us unique is that we are on a long-established heroin corridor that has been an active market for decades. So what we saw in Philadelphia was not so much the establishment of a new opioid market, but the corruption of an existing one through the influx of synthetics. And I believe the entire increase in overdoses, if you look at the numbers, is driven by the introduction of fentanyl into the heroin supply line.
Devin, I have a question for you. Do you have any insight from your experience on the opioid task force why they downgraded the overdose prevention harm reduction subcommittee's recommendation to go forward to pilot one or more supervised injection sites in Philadelphia to a decision to explore?
Yeah, you know, I think that when we talk about opening a SIF or a CUE in Philadelphia, I think there is a lot we need to explore. We need to look at what federal regulations need to be changed, what local regulations need to be changed, and how we can make that happen, because the last thing we want to do is come up with a program to help people not die of this terrible disease, substance use disorder, and then have the FBI or the DEA come in and shut it down. I think it takes time to consensus build around things like that. And I think in the several months since the task force report came out, that more and more people are opening up to the idea because we're educating them. And this is really what we need in the light of closing the homeless camp and things like that. You know, we know that these people are still out there that still need help, and if we could find some place to engage them and be one of the first places in the country to open one of these up, I think it'd be really exciting for our city and the people that live here.
And Chris, Devin actually mentioned the eviction of El Campamento and the day users. El Campamento was the homeless encampment up on the Conrail tracks around Gurney and Masher, and there was a whole area of day use that stretched all the way to Emerald Street. Can you talk about the impact of the eviction and how that's affected the community in the greater discussion?
Sure. Well, I would say El Campamento was a place that very few people would have known existed. If you drove past it, you would not know it was there. It existed for a long time, and at certain points, there was a development of homeless encampments down there. So, you know, there were some shacks. Most of the people did not live down there, but it was a secluded user site where drugs were also sold. That was off the beaten path of sort of the community. And I spent a lot of time there through the spring and summer, and watched as this sort of organic experiment in crowdsourced harm reduction grew out of what the media called a heroin hellscape. And I think that's kind of like looking at a field hospital in Syria and saying, gee, I really wouldn't want to have my heart surgery there. Well, of course you wouldn't, but if you're in the middle of a war zone, this was doing what its purpose was. So with the distribution of Narcan or naloxone, which became more prevalent over the past couple of years in Philadelphia, and users themselves are now engaged in recovery efforts post-overdose, and that's something that was not a part of the heroin community 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So El Campamento it became a place to buy and use drugs, and also, should you overdose, in most cases, a place to avoid dying. With the displacement, that the people that were there are still out there using. It's just all been pushed east. So without giving away specific locations, I can tell you that they're all still out there. They're just not where they used to be, hidden.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Devin, what are the political obstacles to making supervised injection happen in Philly? And what role in particular do you see for the city's African-American leadership and citizenry?
That's a great question, Paul. I think that we have a lot of issues, and they don't start here in Philadelphia. They really start down in Harrisburg. You know, heroin is a Schedule I drug, right? So that means that it has, very little or no medical use, and that it is highly addictive. And so the way the federal government works around Schedule I drugs is that they don't want them around, they don't want them used, so on and so forth. So the question becomes, in a country like America, do we need to change the scheduling of the drug? And that means Congress needs to get involved. And I don't need to tell you how hard it is to get Congress to do anything these days. Secondly, it comes down to Harrisburg. We're seeing, we live in a state that has a Republican-controlled legislature and a Democrat in the governor's mansion. And I'm not really sure how progressive the Republican legislature is when it comes to harm reduction policies like needle exchanges, let alone supervised injection sites. But when we're talking about drilling down to here in Philadelphia, I think a lot more people are open to supervised injection sites than people would think. People in leadership need to be educated. The city council, the mayor's office, of course, has got a lot of education on this. And I think people need to go and see what's going on with these supervised injection sites in other countries. And lastly, I think that the African-American community, it's time for us to step up and address something that's been disproportionately affecting us forever. The war on drugs in the 1980s that really consumed my own father's life was not the war that we see today. The opioid epidemic calls for this more compassionate care, this nicer face treatment over incarceration. And the black community suffered under those previous policies, and we should be able to have a benefit of these new policies, and we should encourage policies that incorporate restorative justice, because so many black men are still incarcerated in jail under school zone policies, so on and so forth. So I think it's on our black churches, it's on the local NAACP chapter, it's on all these Black Lives Matter Philadelphia. It's on them to step up and say, drugs are in our community and we must do something about it, because we're just not the leading voice, and that has to change.
One reason I asked that question was because I know that the issue has come up in terms of the framing of this whole debate about whether we move forward on supervised injection, and there's a lot of discussion and from some of the policy leadership that this is an issue that's coming from out of the that you get a lot of people coming from the suburbs into the city, and who is going to bear the brunt of housing, what community is going to host this.
Right.
But I also had a really interesting experience at Philadelphia Assembled the other day when I went over and took a look at the exhibition. It's a great exhibition that's over in the Art Museum. And there were 3 people there, and they were looking at a mural that had one of their relatives on the mural. And afterwards, they wandered around, and they came up to me and one of the museum curators and started complaining about the way that incarcerated people were being presented, that they didn't include the crimes that they were accused of. And they felt like that this was sort of a not realistic way of addressing a community's pain, that many people have been victimized in the drug war by all kinds of violence, and to get into these intellectual discussions is unfair, and you have to talk about this emotional factor. But I also realized that, then they started talking about drug users, and they made some derogatory comments, and I realized that there's a paradox. People want to move away from incarceration, but at the same time, they have a lot of anger.
Sure, and that's been that way since the crack wars, because communities supported those tough sentences. And then they suffered from them. So we're repeating the same mistakes, and it's hard. It is hard to go into a community and tell them that you're hurting yourself. You know what I mean? Through these policies will come back and bite you in the ass, right? So I think it's very similar with in some places what's going on in the Latino community and around Gurney Street.
Right. And if I could just add one more thing, I think that what we need to do is educate people that, one, prevention works. We don't spend enough money on prevention in Pennsylvania or in the country. And secondly, we need to let people know that if someone does develop a substance use disorder or an addiction, that they can get better. And once we start putting a face on the people that have these problems, I think people are going to be much less likely to embrace these hard-on crime policies and see the humanity.
Good night. Thank you very much. We want to end on a positive note. We have a photo of what the future can look like when we have community cohesion. It's the Paul Yaber Garden on the 2900 block of North American Street in Kensington. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.